That is the sound I make when I'm slapping some ash and I get a splinter in my hand. I've made a lot of tables over the years, and there are a handful that really stand out as being both a challenging build and really interesting from a design standpoint. But outside of that, dining tables are really very similar, and sometimes you just start knocking them out and feeling like you're building the same thing over and over again. So when you get the opportunity to build something in a different way, you get really excited. And that's what happened with this table. My client started wanting one thing, and we ended up landing on another thing, which was me doing breadboard ends on this table, which was great because I hadn't done them in a long time, and I really enjoy doing them. The problem was, when I was just about to start breaking everything down and start making this table, she called me and told me that she no longer wants breadboard ends. I was creatively bummed out because I just felt like it was going to be me building the same table I've built a million other times. But on top of that, it's a weird dimension. It's 4 foot wide and 7 feet long, which is just kind of bizarre, to be honest. The bottom line is, this isn't for me though. It's for her and for her space. And as a furniture maker, I really do get a lot of joy from making things for other people and for their spaces. And don't get me wrong, my favorite part about furniture making and woodworking is doing stuff for myself. It's where I get to be the most creative. But there is a certain amount of creativity that you have to find in building within certain limitations. This whole table is going to be made of ash. That's the base and the top. And over the years, I've really grown to love ash. It's a very hard and durable wood, but it also tools really nicely, and it really specifically hand tools really nicely. But it has a lot of grain characteristics, and it's just a pretty wood. And I think my only complaints about ash is that it gets really splintery and it's very heavy. This must be what Busta Rhymes felt like in the early 2000s, because I am covered in ash.
We've got all of our boards roughly milled. Everything's a little bit thicker, a little bit wider, and a little bit longer than it's gonna be when we get it to its final size. I've got all these boards stacked and stickered here so that the moisture, if there was any in the boards, can evenly evacuate the boards over the next few days. They'll sit here for about 3 days, and then I'll come back and I'll take everything down to its final dimensions. The next thing I gotta do is glue up these leg blanks, and I'm gonna make sure that both faces have a really nice even coating of glue so that you get a really strong glue joint. After that, you'll see me in 3 days when I'm gonna finish milling up all this material, and then we're gonna get into gluing up the tabletop.
The legs on this table are going to be 3 by 3 at their finished dimension, and to make them out of one stick, I need to get a piece of wood that's thicker than that, believe it or not, because I still have to joint and plane it down to its final size so I can get it nice and square. Unfortunately, my hardwood dealer does not have that material on hand very often, so the best solution is for me to make it myself. So what I did was took some 1.5 inch material and I made it 3 inches wide. So now I'm putting 2 of those together and I'm getting a 3 by 3 leg. At this point in the build, the only thing I was really looking forward to in terms of the design was that the legs were going to be tapered. So I was really taking care to make sure that this all lined up and worked out really well, because it was going to be the only thing about this table that had any sort of pizzazz to it. I don't even know what the right word is, but if it wasn't for the tapers on this table, this thing would look like a big bunch of rectangles stacked on top of each other. We didn't show it in camera, but I had just paste waxed all the beds on my jointer and my planer and my table saw, because for some reason in my experience, ash really gets a lot of friction on the cast iron and it just drags across the table. So if you don't have a freshly waxed table, that ash is gonna really drag. Here you can see me ripping down the aprons. This is the long apron here, and then I do the short apron next. I cut those down to 3 inches to match the legs that are also 3 by 3. These are the leg blanks I had made earlier. They are oversized at about 3 1/4 by 3 1/4. And off camera, I jointed 2 sides, 2 perpendicular sides, so I could cut these down to their final size of 3 inches by 3 inches. Wait for it. You're going to want to see this next part. This is such a sick move. Watch this. Oh, yeah.
So I'm back in the shop. It's been 3 days, and I just got done milling everything to its final sizes besides the length. We'll deal with the length down the line. So what we're going to do next is we're going to glue up our top. And we're going to actually do that in 2 sub-assemblies. But one thing I want to talk about that's really easy way to elevate your pieces is to pay attention to your grain orientation. So I'm gonna start laying out on my boards and see which pieces have defects where, because none of these boards are perfect. And if I can get most or all of my defects on the bottom side, it saves me time for the finishing process. You can see down this board here, there's a knot there, so let's flip it and see how this other side looks. Well, looks a lot better, so we're gonna have that down. This side doesn't have any knots, but it might be more appealing for the rest of the board. So it's good to know that this piece has no real defects in it. So when I look at the tabletop overall right now, this is kind of a hodgepodge of different grains and colors, almost the shades are different. So one thing I like to do is either almost make the shades become a book match, so it gets lighter to darker or darker to lighter, one way or the other. Or you can stagger it. I don't really like the stagger look. I like the gradient change. I think that looks really nice. So we're gonna start with the darker boards out and move into the lighter boards and see if we like that. And then we'll flip it and we'll see if we like that more. So it really depends on the tabletop that you're working with, because all these boards are so unique. So let's see how these look real quick. Everything can be rotated. Okay, so I've landed on my grain orientation. Ash is pretty crazy. It's got a lot of character and it's very grain heavy. So this is gonna have a lot of character in it. That's just how it works with Ash. So I'm gonna do this glue up in 2 assemblies. This is 8 boards. So I'm gonna break it up into 1 4-board glue up and another 4-board glue up. This is 48 inches wide. So this is a huge panel. So doing this with one person is kind of stressful. And frankly, it's very heavy and just hard to move by yourself. So I'll get this one glued up first and I'll glue this one up at the same time. And then after a few hours, I'll glue both of them up together. So let's get going.
I'm using a track saw track to mark up where my dominoes are gonna go on my tabletop. Now you 100% do not need to use a domino to glue up a tabletop. There's so much glue surface area on these joints that it's gonna be very strong. However, I really like to use the domino for this because it keeps the top of the boards in alignment with each other, which saves me time when I have to go sand. I don't have to sand anything flush anymore because it's already flush. And you could make the argument that, well, now you're spending time setting up for the domino and you could just be doing that sanding. Well, I would rather have a dog gnawing off my leg than spend more time sanding. Something to note here is that when you're using the domino to glue up large panels like this, you don't need to put any glue in the mortises. It doesn't add to anything that you're doing here. You can, it doesn't hurt anything. But like I said before, the dominoes are only there for alignment. It's not adding any strength to this glue up. One thing about being a furniture maker and having clients that aren't furniture makers is that they don't speak the same language that we do as woodworkers. We have very specific phrases and ways to describe things that work for us and makes communicating amongst ourselves very quick. Clients don't have any of that. Case in point, and this is not a dig on my client at all because truthfully, there's no reason for her to know what breadboard ends are called. She's not a woodworker, she's my client. When she told me that, she said she didn't want the edging anymore. And I took a solid 5 minutes staring at my phone trying to understand what that meant. And once I did figure it out, obviously I was very disappointed in the fact that we weren't going to be doing breadboard ends on this table anymore. But it just goes to show that it's my job as the furniture maker to take my client's hand and walk them through this whole process.
I just got done roughly marking up where my mortises are gonna go on my legs. We are gonna be using mortise and tenon for this, which is a very tried and true method to join up wood. If you don't know what that is, you'll see what it is in just a minute. But what I did is orient where I want my mortises to go because I want the nicest parts of the wood facing out and the ugliest parts facing in, so they're hidden. And that is 70% of woodworking.
For some reason, I got it in my head that I wanted to do all the mortises on this video for this project with just a drill press and a chisel. And my thought was, oh, I'll use more entry-level tools and make this a bit more relatable. But honestly, it ended up causing some headaches because I haven't used this method in a very long time. And while it did go faster than I thought it was gonna go, I haven't done it in so long that I had fallen out of practice and I did run into some issues. The problem I was running into is that some of my mortises were coming out a bit sloppier than I would have liked, and I think that's a result of run out on my drill press. But at the end of the day, all the joints ended up being very strong and there was plenty of glue surface area to make these things last a lifetime. When I first started woodworking, most of my experience was with power tools. I didn't get into hand tools. I had some, but I never really got into it, and it just kind of always eluded me because I could do what I needed to do with power tools. My real issue with hand tools was that I never got good at sharpening them, and hand tools really require you to have a sharp edge to get joy out of them. About 6 months ago, I spent some time and energy really reading up and learning how to sharpen my tools and buying some good stones for that and getting a good method together that I could enjoy. And ever since then, I'm just falling in love with hand tools so much. It's just such an enjoyable process. And honestly, there's just so many times where hand tools are just the better tool for the job. I also got it in my head to do all the tenons on the table saw for the sake of the process being a bit more relatable to people with more entry-level tools. And honestly, I'm really glad I did this as well because I haven't done this in years, and it was, again, way faster than I thought it would be. And really all you need is a dado stack, and you don't actually need a dado stack. It just makes it go much faster because you're removing so much material so fast. But you need the dado stack, and you need a nice stop block and a nice miter gauge or like a big crosscut sled or something. But ultimately what you're doing is just removing material so that you have a tenon left over that fits right into your mortise. Some of the shoulders on some of the tenons weren't lining up perfectly, and I think what was happening is because the pieces were so long and I was using a miter gauge, they were dragging on my table saw top. So what I did is I got out my crosscut sled and another stop block, and because I had my crosscut sled, it actually lifted them off of the table saw and eliminated that friction, so I got really perfect tenons using this method.
The next step after the joinery is to do the tapers. These legs are all getting tapers on them. And I can't do them on my table saw because this material is too thick. But the real point that I want to push here is that you want to do all your joinery before you've put your taper on, because it's going to get real kind of wonky to work with and you don't have a very long surface area to reference against. So this I've already tapered, and you can see there that it's got the taper in there. So if I was trying to cut this mortise in here and this piece is just rocking like this or rocking or those issues, it'd get very annoying, and you just don't want to do that to yourself. I had already marked where my tapers are going to be. It's a very nice line, very legible, and you can tell what it is. And like I said, I already set this up and did one of these already. So this is going to go in here, and I have these stops in place that go to my marks. Let's pull this down just a little bit. So this bottom down here will just rest up against these stops, and then this will rest up against this. Clamp it down. Let's put this back a bit. Clamp it down. And then now I'm ready to start cutting the taper on this face. So let's get that going. There we go. There's the one. So I'm going to take this over here and I'm going to flip it to get my other side. Essentially, your tapers end up being on the faces where your joinery is.
Oddly enough, the bandsaw left a bunch of bandsaw marks on the tapers, so I took them over to the jointer and then jointed the two faces, and then I took it over to my Moxon vise and used my hand plane to clean up the tooling marks from the jointer. At 4 foot wide and 7 foot long, this table has a very large footprint. It's wider than I typically like to make my tables. I like to make them about 36 to 40 inches wide, and that allows you to be able to pass the salt without almost having to stand up to someone who's on the other side of the table. But the client wanted a table that's 48 inches wide because I'm trying to match a table that was already in the space.
I just got done doing my dry fit on all my pieces. I wanted to make sure that my joinery is nice and tight. And what I'm really looking for is that these shoulders on these tenons are tight up against the legs, because that is what makes this really strong. And that's where the mortise and tenon really shines, because this is just a really rigid, strong joint that will last for a long time. Putting these all together dry was a little stressful, so when you add in glue, it gets really stressful. So to mitigate the stress, you can glue this up in sub-assemblies like we did with the tabletop. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna glue together these short sides first, and then after those are dry and I've cleaned those up, I'm gonna glue together the long sides And that's how we'll do the subassembly. This table is very wide. It's not incredibly long, but it is very wide. And because of that, I want to put in a middle stretcher, and that will help with racking and just overall strength of the base. So before I take any of this apart, I'm going to measure this, and I'm going to cut down a piece, and I'm going to get this ready for joinery. For the joinery, I am to be using a mortise and tenon, but it's technically a floating tenon. It's the domino. This does not need to be nearly as rigid as these connections do. I just want it to add some strength to the middle of the table base. I've got my mid stretcher all cut down and sized up and marked up. So now I'm gonna start taking everything apart, and then it's time to sand. And then I'm gonna put the tabletop together and make that one big panel. And then after that, we'll start talking about the finishing process.
Determining what finish I was going to be using for this was a bit of a tricky balance because my client wanted a new thing, but she also wanted to sort of emulate the table that was being replaced. And it was tough because I was making a nice hardwood table and I was replacing a table that was kind of not made really great, but it was also made of pine, and I really don't like pine. Pine is garbage in my opinion. It has its place for sure, and that's in the walls of a house. And I wish I had kept some pictures of the table so we could share it in this video, but I didn't because I wanted to completely erase it from my memory. It was a pine top, and the finish on it, I believe, was just like a furniture wax or some sort of paste wax that had mostly been worn away over years of use, which I'm not complaining about years of use on a table. I think furniture should be lived in, and that's what its point is. It needs to be used. But the base had spindle legs that were painted white multiple times over the years. So us trying to find a healthy balance between that and a new table was a little tough. Technically, when you're doing a mortise in ash, it's actually called an ash hole. To check if my legs are plumb, I'm going to throw a tape across the diagonals of the piece and see if they're the same length. And if they're the exact same length, they're exactly plumb. These happen to come out about a 30-second off from each other, which I'm totally happy with. Here I'm marking up to glue up the two panels that make up the top. Because it is so wide, I didn't want to do it all at once, so I did it into two panels, and now I'm just marking up so that I can join those two panels together into one big super panel. This is a method I came up with a few years ago, and prior to that time, these screw clamps were useless in my shop. I have no real other use for them up until I came up with this. And what I do is I attach the screw clamps to the side of the panel like I have there, and I use that to hold the panel up vertically. This allows me to have it stand up while I put my glue down for the glue joint and set in my dominoes, and then when I bring the other panel over there and set it on top of it, it brings them together with gravity. And it kind of holds it in place while I can set up all the clamps and get everything ready to sit up for the glue up. Man, really got to watch your fingers there. That's really close. But you can see it just kind of pulls itself together, uses gravity, and it works out great. And you can even let it just sit there like I was saying. And then you can just pull the piece up, slide your clamp in, bring it all together. Bingo, bango, boingo. You got yourself a super panel. I'm using the domino to join together the mid-stretcher and the two aprons, and it's such a great tool for this application. It has so many points of reference on the tool that you don't have to do a whole lot of markup to perfectly land where your mortise needs to be for the tenon. I think my biggest complaint about the domino is that they named the tool the domino, but they also call the tenons you use dominoes. Like, what? That doesn't make any sense. Like, for reals, how did that marketing meeting go? Where it was like, hey, this tool, check this thing out. It's really great for joining up stuff. We're gonna call it the domino. And then like the manager is like, cool, but what are we gonna call the tenons? We'll call it the domino. Okay, but like we have to plug it in, so what are we gonna call the plugs for the outlets when we plug it into the wall? What should we call that? Surely we can't call it a domino. We'll call it a domino. I like to sand all my large horizontal surfaces with this sander here. It's a great sander, and it's actually just a normal 6-inch sander. I'm just a very small person. A mistake that a lot of beginning woodworkers make is to make their tops at the final length that they're gonna be when it's done, before they're done putting it all together. And you just really don't want to do that. You want to leave yourself some extra play in the table just in case some things like in-grain checking appears or something gets busted or just something's not right. This just gives you a little bit of play so that at the end of the job, when you're done, you can cut everything down to size just before you're about to start sanding and finishing everything. I had some end grain checking on the top of this table, so I'm really glad I left a few inches on this one so that I could cut it down to final size and get rid of that end grain checking.
I've got a defect on the top side of the table, and that is a result of me actually trying to have the least defects on the top of the table. And what I mean is this particular board had 3 knots on the other side, and instead of fighting with 3 knots on this side, now I only have to fight with this little broken off piece here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna clean this out, remove it, make a nice little rectangular like mortise pocket there, and then I'm gonna fill it with another piece of wood that has grain very similar to that. So let me get going on that right now.
I used a marking knife and a straight edge to score the wood before I started removing the waste with the router plane. This router plane is actually very nice. I'm really happy with it. I don't get to use it that often, but when I do, it's always a pleasure. Once I got done removing the bulk of the waste, I cleaned it up with a chisel, and then I started making a piece to fit into that spot to patch it. If only there was a tool that could knock wood in so you didn't have to use your hands. Oh, well, there we go. Perfect right there. I think when we get started as woodworkers, and I'll include myself here because this was true for me, the very first piece of furniture that I ever made when I started to get into furniture making was a table, and I'll never forget the piece. I still have the piece in my home to this day, and I'll hopefully never get rid of it. But what's great about tables is there's so many fundamental woodworking basics in there and furniture making basics. And when you're done, you have this really great, well, it's probably not that great your first time, but you have this usable piece of furniture that you've made for yourself. This is a urethane-based wood filler that I like to use. I've been using it for a few years now, and it's been great. It's good for like small cracks and voids, up to like medium cracks and voids. But it's called P-Tech, and it has about 4 colors, I think, but I typically use the black the most. It has a 4-minute open time, and it's ready to sand. They say in 20 minutes, but I usually give it 30 to 45 minutes, and it just works great. This is another wood filler product called Famo Wood. I use this a lot when I'm working on ash or white oak. Their species color matches are really good on those 2 species, and I really like how much it can make imperfections disappear. I had a couple of tear out spots on the glue line of the top, and after applying this, you just can't even tell it's there. It's like it never happened.
Let's talk about attaching the top to the base. For that, I like to use these little tabletop clips. This is like a modified design from something that's been around for a million years. Maybe not that long, but slightly less. But this basically allows me to put this piece here and insert it here, and then run a screw through this into the tabletop or some other attachment device. And what's great about this is when you're having wood movement, and since this is such a large tabletop, it's always gonna happen across the grain, not along the grain. And with these mortises cut in with a wider slot, it allows us to move side to side. Also, on these ones over here, this goes in here, because this hole is slotted lengthwise, it allows for movement for the screw to go side to side as well.
Okay, so for reals, this is the Gem 11-inch sander. This thing is really awesome for big tabletops. It makes sanding a breeze, and it cuts the time by more than in half. I mean, it's like a quarter of the time. I don't know, it's incredible. I think we can all agree that sanding sucks and that hand sanding sucks even more, but sometimes you just really need to finesse that finish and you just can't do it without hand sanding. For the finish, we ended up landing on Rubio Monocoat Cotton White. And that is the most white pigmented finish that Rubio makes. And this is definitely an homage to the old table. That table, like I said, had 5 or 6 layers of white paint on the base. And we just kind of wanted to emulate that a bit, but not paint it, because honestly, I really avoid painting any wood pieces at all costs. It's just something in me that I can't do. It feels wrong and unnatural, and I really just don't want to do it. This piece was really an emotional roller coaster for me because it started out as something that I didn't want to do, which is a refinish job, and then it turned into something I was very, very excited about, which was doing breadboard ends on a table, and I hadn't done it in so long. I was just really looking forward to it. But when that went away, I was creatively really bummed out, and I was not looking forward to finishing this piece, and it was just going to become another piece that I build in the shop. But as time went on through the process, I got really excited, and I remembered how much of a pleasure it is to build furniture for someone else, and how great these pieces do end up coming out in the end. I mean, look at this piece. It looks really good. It's super clean, it's got great lines, and ultimately, I'm just really happy with this. The last thing to do is attach the tabletop clips so I can connect the top to the base. And then it's time to deliver this thing to its new home, which is actually its only home because it wasn't actually living here. It was just born here. And that's really what's cool about this, because I'm delivering newborn furniture to people, which basically makes me a doctor.